My name is Beverley Whitrick. I am the Strategic Director of Music Venue Trust. Music Venue Trust is a charity created in 2014 to protect, secure and improve the UK's grassroots music venues. By this we mean the sorts of generally small, local, independent-run venues which operate around the whole of the UK in small towns as well as bigger cities. And these are the places where artists get to have their first taste of going on stage, of developing their stagecraft, of connecting with audiences. There are also venues which have diverse types of music, and quite often they're the places that more established artists will come back to if they want to try out new things, or they just want to play in a more intimate setting. They're incredibly important for the cultural development of musicians, but also the local social and cultural development of an area. They bring communities together. One of the early campaigns that Music Venue Trust worked on beginning in 2015 was a campaign to bring Agent of Change to the UK and encourage the governments to adopt it as law. Agent of change is a very common sense idea that the person creating the conditions of a change is responsible for mitigating against them. And in practical terms, it can be used in planning. So, for example, if somebody builds new residential accommodation near an existing music venue, the developer is entirely responsible for making sure that that accommodation is properly soundproofed and attenuated so that the residents will not be disturbed by the noise from the venue nearby. Unfortunately, in British law, it's always been the case that residents have greater powers than any noisemakers, with the possible exception of transport. Basically, if you want to complain about something nearby that's disturbing you in your home, we have very old laws in the UK that enable you to do that. So we were very interested in encouraging the various governments of the UK to adopt Agent of Change as law. Now, we've had varying degrees of success with that. We do have Agent of Change in the London Plan. The Mayor of London was the first to adopt it. It's now in Welsh planning policy, in English planning policy and in Scottish planning policy. And in Scotland, they are discussing at the moment adopting it into legislation, which would mean the difference between what planners should do into what planners must do. So we believe it can be quite a powerful tool if adopted in the right way, but it is only in planning and therefore it does only protect venues from new buildings nearby. It still doesn't give them protection from somebody moving into an existing building. The threats to grassroots music venues are many and varied, and in our experience over the last 5 years, what often happens is a venue will start with one threat and that will weaken their position, and then the other damaging things around them basically stack up to the point where it just doesn't become feasible to carry on running a venue anymore. So the reason there's been a lot of talk about Agent of Change is that for a lot of venues, this process starts with a noise complaint. Somebody will move into newly constructed flats nearby to a venue. They will then complain that noise from the venue disrupts their lives, disturbs them in some way. What happens when somebody makes a noise complaint to their local authority is the authority has a duty to inform the noisemaker that a complaint has been made, and that immediately sets up the idea that the venue has done something wrong, even though it's probably continuing to work in the same way that it always has. What happens then is that the venues have to basically justify or fight against it. Sometimes they are expected to soundproof because it's seen as their problem rather than the problem of the accommodation or the person who's moved into it. And then you get into spending money that venues don't really have because budgets are very tight in venues. Basically, the model on which a lot of music venues operate used to be feasible in the 70s and 80s, but the costs of running those venues have rocketed. the things that they have to buy now in terms of insurance policies and other compliance things are huge compared to perhaps when some of these venues started out. And then at the same time, the margins on the beer they sell behind the bar, even the amount of beer they're able to sell might have decreased. Plus, ticket prices really haven't gone up. The differential between prices that people are prepared to pay in large venues and prices that they pay in small venues is quite enormous. And the problem is that if you're still not taking much money, but you have ever increasing bills to pay, then it's harder and harder to stay afloat. So if something expected, like having to bring in a lawyer to deal with a complaint or having to invest in something you haven't planned for happens, then you've got real financial problems. Compounding this is the massive rise in business rates that many venues have faced in the last 12 months. And this is a major factor that has just sounded the death knell for many venues, because the business rates have gone up, which means they have to find extra money that they're not taking. This can then lead to the owner of the actual building, because the majority of grassroots music venues operate in rented buildings. Some of the owners of the leases will look at the fact the business rates have gone up and will say, oh, great, this is worth more now, at which point they'll then put the rent up. This just doesn't stack up. I mean, a venue that was just about getting by anyway cannot possibly afford a hike in business rates and rent. So during the last 6 months, we've seen, sadly, a huge number of venues close because they just can't afford to stay open anymore. They can't make it work. The final point I made there about business rates really does bring us to a good question about what councils and governments can do to protect and support grassroots music venues. One of the major things that Music Venue Trust has always campaigned on is a recognition for grassroots music venues as cultural spaces. A lot of the problems faced are compounded by the fact that these very important spaces for culture, for socialising and for employing local people and bringing money into the economy are just viewed as profit-making businesses by governments and local authorities. That means that then they're treated like a nightclub or a bar or a shop rather than like an arts centre or a theatre or a gallery. And what this means is that the costs put onto them, the way they're policed, the way their licenses are viewed, are so much stricter and assume that things can be paid for that there really isn't the money for. So we've been campaigning for a long time for recognition now for grassroots music venues as key cultural assets. If you're recognised as a cultural asset, there is the ability for the local authority to treat you in a different way. There's also issues around legal terminology. We've recently approached the UK government about asking whether grassroots music venues can have the same business rates discount that's been offered for restaurants, bars and pubs, and we're told no. And yet many of them are legally classed as pubs. There is no legal definition of a music venue, yet the government has said no, local authorities shouldn't class a music venue as a pub or bar, but they also can't class them as an arts space or a cultural space. We're just falling down through the cracks in every way. And for this reason, in order to protect this vital network, we need recognition by councils and governments of grassroots music venues as cultural assets, so that then the various protections afforded to our nation's creative spaces can also be afforded to these creative spaces. Grassroots music venues are important parts of the local economy, in that they attract people to a place to spend their money, but they also have an interesting effect on the surrounding area. There was a piece of work done by the Mayor's team in London to quantify what that is, and it discovered that for every £10 spent on tickets for gigs, £17 was spent in addition in the local economy. This goes on things like transport, it goes on other food and drink in the area. It's basically the things around going out to a night of music. Bear in mind also that venues are sending the artists out to have something to eat or bringing in food for the artists. They might be putting up touring artists in local hotels or guest houses. They employ local people. They quite often buy their supplies from the local community. So the closure of a grassroots music venue can actually have quite a huge impact on its local economy. And this was evidenced when Passing Clouds in East London actually went to a lot of the nearby traders in the run-up to its closure, asking for testimonials about the importance of that venue to that area of Dalston. And in particular, the taxi companies, the late night food outlets, the corner shops all said that they would notice a tangible drop in takings if that one venue were to close, because they were really aware of when there were good events happening at the venue, because there was an uptake in their services. The taxi company was a particularly interesting one because this was a venue that had world music events that people travelled across the whole of London to. So the taxi company did really well with late night rides home whenever they had a big touring artist on. So there is a huge impact on local economies from these small spaces, which makes them important economically as well as culturally and socially. Music Venue Trust was originally created to be a kind of national trust for venues. Our long-term goal has always been to secure the freeholds of some of this vital network of venues by buying them and holding them in charity and leasing them back to the operators on a peppercorn rent. The reason that we want to do this is that we believe it is the most effective way of securing the future of the network of grassroots music venues as music venues in perpetuity. A huge number of the problems that venues face are to do with them being within the commercial market and therefore subject to commercial pressures. If you remove the need to pay the rent and the business rates of a profit-making business, then they have money to reinvest in improving the experience of providing amazing events for both artists and audiences, developing artists, providing an important social and cultural space for local communities to meet. We genuinely believe that enabling this to happen would be the most effective model of safeguarding these venues in the future. So, what we set out to do as a long-term goal, it's kind of taken us time to build the evidence that this is what's really needed. But we are now working on a very big initiative called the Pipeline Investment Fund, which is a project working in partnership with quite a lot of important players in the live music industry, and hopefully over time with the whole music industry, to form partnerships to ensure that the music industry itself reinvests back in its grassroots to ensure the future sustainability of that music industry. Now, what this would mean is that the more successful parts of the industry invested small amounts of the profit it makes back into venues to ensure that the future possibility of these spaces as places for artists to develop, skills to grow, audiences to connect can continue. The danger that we risk of these venues disappearing is that over time it will erode the base of the whole industry. And the music industry is one of the few growing parts of the UK economy at the moment. It's an incredibly vital part of our creative economy. And so the argument that we have carefully laid out and that's now really gaining traction is that this would be reinvestment from the music industry back in the research and development part of that industry. So the Pipeline Investment Fund is absolutely our priority. over the next few years. We need to secure this, we need to create the mechanisms for it to work, and we need to start channeling that investment back into these venues and ensuring that they thrive in the future. So that's about protect and secure the venues. The third part of what we do is improve those venues. And physical improvements are desperately needed. A lot of the venues just haven't had the cash to invest in, particularly the tech in those venues. And therefore the sound and lighting are not as good as they should be. One of the ways in which grassroots music venues are incredibly important is that they've provided a kind of informal training environment for technicians of the future. Anecdote from the other day. One of the sound engineers at Abbey Road approached our chief executive, Mark David, and thanked him for the fact that his first taste of working in music had been volunteering at the Tunbridge Wells Forum, which Mark co-owns. And this guy, Leon, had volunteered at Tunbridge Wells Forum, had got his first taste of sound engineering there, and is now one of the team at Abbey Road Studios, one of the most famous recording studios in the world. Now, that's the sort of opportunity that grassroots music venues spread across the country, particularly the ones in small towns, can offer to people who might like to do something creative. But you're not going to get great experience if you go to a venue and all of the technical equipment's basically held together with gaffer tape. What we need is decent equipment in there so that this informal training, this first taste of something exciting which inspires people and sets them on a path, has real relevance. At the same time, for developing artists, I was talking with one of our artist patrons last week, and she said to me, as a developing artist, I really can't afford to take a sound engineer on the road with me. If I knew that every venue I went to had really good sound system, had a really good desk, I wouldn't need to try and find the money for the sound engineer, because I would know that when I arrived at the venue, it would all be sorted. They would have someone there, they would have the kit, they would have the personnel, and the sound would be what I want my audience to hear. The quality of the experience in these spaces is so important, which brings us to another really important factor, improving access. We need the widest audiences possible to be able to experience music in local venues, and all artists. You know, access is an artist issue as well as being an audience issue. And not enough of our venues have the money to invest in making sure those venues are as accessible as possible. This is something we all want to happen, and it's only the cash that's the problem here. People are so committed to opening up access, but sometimes you need the money to physically invest in making that happen. And then there are also issues like investing in buildings to make sure that the kit that's in there is energy efficient. This is for two reasons. It's one, about making the buildings run more efficiently, but it's also about saving money. And our venues want to be environmentally aware. They want to be contributing to doing things responsibly, but again, that costs money. So there's a huge amount to do about getting the proper investment into these venues to improve both artist and audience experience. That is key work in parallel with continuing to work with governments, with local authorities for the recognition of grassroots music venues as key cultural and social spaces, and ensuring that policy and legislation goes with that to make sure that they're not overcharged in business rates, that nearby planning is not going to impact negatively on them. It's about trying to find a way for our nighttime economy, our cultural economy, to coexist with good accommodation in towns and city centres, so that the people on the doorstep have a positive relationship with well-run venues, rather than there being friction between these very important parts of town and city life.